G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. The story is that tonight's big idea program is going to be on whether the Australian-American alliance is the best path ahead for Australia. So I thought we might like to pay attention to big ideas.
Is the US alliance still Australia's best defence? For over 60 years, Australia's national security has depended on it. But do we rely too much on the US alliance? If it came to the crunch, would US self-interest trump any obligations it has under the Australian alliance? And what does it mean strategically in the Asian century? Do we need to choose between the US and China? The prospect of invasion appears remote. Non-state actors pose a greater threat. So does aligning ourselves with the US make more sense? The US is our best defence is the proposition for tonight's Intelligence Squared debate. On the affirmative side, we have the US Ambassador to Australia, Geoffrey Bleisch. Speaking for the negative, retired Major General Jim Molan. He's had a long and distinguished career in the Australian Defence Force. In a break with tradition, this evening we'll hear formal presentations from these two speakers. Then after the break, an extended Q&A session where we welcome to the stage Catherine Ziesing, the editor of Australian Defence Force magazine, and Professor Zhu Feng, Deputy Director of the Centre for International and Strategic Studies at Peking University. Let's now take a seat in the recital hall at Angel Place in Sydney for tonight's Intelligence Squared debate that the US alliance is our best defence. Here's Geoffrey Bleisch, US Ambassador to Australia.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for stating the proposition that the U.S. alliance is Australia's best defense. I'm sure that as ambassador to the United States, it's a big surprise to everyone that I am in favor of the proposition that the U.S. alliance is Australia's best defense. You probably think it's some sort of job requirement. But the truth is, ambassadors have lots of excuses to avoid public appearances, so I wouldn't show up here if Intelligence Squared hadn't promised me that I would get the winning side of the debate. So the fact that I'm here proves that it's a true proposition. Thank you all for coming, and I'll look forward to seeing you for refreshments. Now, in fact, no ambassador would argue that an alliance is always the best defense for every threat. For example, if Australia's biggest threat today were rabbit infestation, then an alliance would not be its best defense. The core of the question is really this: what are the genuine threats that face Australia today, and what does Australia need in order to defend against them? Today, the greatest threats that are facing Australia are not rabbit infestation or an invasion or any kind of conventional conflict. The major threats to Australia in the 21st century are regional or global, and they relate to resource shortages, to cyber exploitation, and to criminal networks. Those things, resources, technology, and criminal networks, do not respect boundaries. And so no one nation alone can address them. Australia's defense, just like America's defense, requires partnering with other nations. The U.S., with the world's largest economy, most sophisticated forces, a 60-year alliance working closely together with Australia, shared values, shared friendship, is key to helping Australia meet these threats. And in fact, most Australians agree, and that's why 82% of Australians are in favor of our alliance. So let me describe what I think Australia's real threats are. The real threat concerns resources. The first one. By 2050, we're going to be adding 2.5 billion people to the middle class in Asia. Middle classes demand more food, water, and energy per person, and they require higher input foods. And that means that this region is going to have to produce more food, water, and energy than is currently capable of producing. If we don't collaborate on these issues, we're going to face some tragic consequences. Widespread droughts and famines, riots, mass migrations, conflicts over resources, and other humanitarian disasters. Now, climate change is only going to compound these effects by making droughts longer, and floods heavier. Now, Australia can't prevent these resource shortages by itself. It needs capable partners with whom it can do the following things. We need anti-corruption measures, because part of the reason that food doesn't make it from paddock to the plate in many countries is because of corruption. Funds are siphoned off, roads aren't completed, resources are squandered. And few countries are better at confronting corruption together than the U.S. and Australia. We need more sustainable technologies like renewable energy, water reuse, and naturally fortified foods. And no two nations are better than the U.S. and Australia at harnessing these technologies together. We need rule of law to share technology safely, reduce barriers to trade for these necessary goods, and to keep navigation lines open. And our two nations are global leaders in establishing and upholding international norms. And Australia needs forces that are capable of responding to crises, to deliver humanitarian aid and disaster relief. And again, no nation in the world does that better than Australia and the U.S. So while every nation in the region has a role to play in Australia's defense against these threats, the U.S. offers the very best part of that defense. Now, the second set of threats that I mentioned come from two new frontiers, space and cyberspace. Every part of our society depends on the security of cyberspace. Our financial systems, our media, our communications, our water supplies, our electrical grids, our command and control, everything, absolutely everything, depends upon cyberspace being secure. So establishing rules to protect networks and rules for cyber safety is absolutely critical to our future. Unfortunately, we need to work very quickly because near space is already crowded with satellites and cyber exploitation is already rampant. There are still very few rules to protect near space satellites and cyber networks from attack or exploitation. And in the meantime, states and non-state actors are compromising, stealing, destroying, and changing information. This is why we've made cyber part of the U.S.-Australia Alliance Treaty. And of all of Australia's partners in the world, no nation is better able or more committed to defend the cyberspace than America. Finally, people love to concoct scenarios, pitting one nation against another in the region. But the truth is that Australia doesn't fear being invaded by another state. Australia's greatest risk from attack comes from non-state actors. And specifically, I'm talking about criminal networks. Networks that are increasingly sophisticated and engaged in everything from terrorism to arms smuggling, drug trafficking, people smuggling, theft of intellectual property, piracy, hacking, and other criminal enterprises. Now, their purposes vary. I mean, some are trying to take down governments, some are trying to destroy cultures, some are just after money and power. But these shadow entities operate without uniforms, without borders, and they target civilians. And this presents unprecedented challenges. The only defense against them is to have friends who share information and pool resources so that we can disrupt and dismantle these networks. And no two nations in the world do this better together than we do. In short, Australia's best defense, the best path to a secure future is simple, to work with its most capable partner to stop these threats. Now let me tell you what we shouldn't be preparing for. First, we shouldn't be preparing for a Cold War or another situation in which nations are pitted against Australia or the U.S. in some zero-sum competition. The great and rising nations of the world are all interdependent today. Now, a lot of people I know sell books or get airtime by suggesting that the U.S. wants to contain China or that China wants to fence out the United States. But anyone can see that this would harm both of our economies. Neither of our governments want it, and neither of our people want it. So China and the U.S. are in fact betting on each other. Nations like Australia will not have to choose between the two of us. And Australia, frankly, is doing the right thing. It's betting on both of us, working with both of us, and focusing instead on the real threats that are out there. Second, we don't have to worry that Australia's engagement with the U.S. makes it a target. Terror networks aren't focused on a nation's flag. They're focused on a nation's form. They're hostile to open societies with democratic structures. So Australia would be a target regardless of its alliance. Where we fight together, it's because we're threatened together. Our alliance is an equal partnership. And anyone who thinks otherwise clearly has never tried to convince an Australian to do something that they don't want to do. I'll just say, we agree on a lot of issues, but trust me, your leaders have no problem saying no to us. The kind of trust and honesty that we have has been earned. 70 years ago, the U.S. and Australia, we made a pact as two Pacific powers to restore peace and prosperity to this region. We helped rebuild Japan. We brought security to the seas. We opened up trade. We brought nations like China into the World Trade Organization. And we championed human and civil rights. And those efforts have been a pillar of Australia's security. History has yet to offer a better foundation for building a safe, prosperous, and free Indo-Pacific than this partnership. And in the 21st century, our fortunes depend more than ever on our partners. No partner is more important to Australia than the U.S. because of our shared history and values, our deep economic interdependence, our extensive security cooperation, and most of all our mateship. Our commitment to each other is bone deep, and that is the reason why the U.S. alliance is Australia's best defense. Thank you.
Jim Molan is a retired Major General in the Australian Army and was named Australian Thinker of the Year in 2009. He commanded multinational forces of 300,000 troops in Iraq and has served all over the world. He was awarded the Legion of Merit by the United States Government and the Distinguished Service Cross by the Australian Government. Please welcome him.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know the topic. Is the US alliance, that's alliance with a capital A, it's not a partnership, it's not friendliness, it's a formal alliance. Is the US alliance our best defence? Those opposite have tried to demonstrate that the benefits to Australia or to any other nation that Australia or any other nation receives from the US alliance is greater than going it alone. I think that so far they haven't established that. What needs to be pointed out fairly early is that if a nation elects not to remain or not to become part of a US alliance, they can still be friends with, they can still trade with, or they can even go to war with the US. Nor does it mean that the current level of totally inadequate defence self-reliance that a country like Australia provides itself with because it is in alliance with the US would be at the same dangerous level if it elected out of the alliance. So along these lines, I ask you, what has the US done for the world apart from freedom, prosperity, the defeat of fascism and the defeat of certain forms of communism? According to the ambassador, it seems to have a lot to do with resources and with cyberspace. But when I look back over the last 50 years, and this is possibly an incomplete list, I see that US military activities have involved conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Cuba, Grenada, Haiti, the Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Somalia, the Balkans, and Afghanistan. And of course, a resounding victory in the Cold War. The US has been busy, and Australia has played a supporting role in some of these. We called it containing communism, restoring democracy, spreading freedom, and the American way of life, humanitarian intervention even, playing international policeman, waging war on terrorism. Most of it, I must admit, was probably justified, and some was even successful. I can't think of too many times in which Australia said no. But I oppose this topic. I don't think that the US alliance is the best defence for countries like Australia. The simple reason is that many in alliance with the US don't use the US alliance for their defence. Instead, their alliance is used as an excuse for avoiding responsible national investment in each individual nation's defence. As such, the US alliance is not good for our defence, it's corrosive. A little while ago I saw comments in particular from then Secretary of Defence Gates that the biggest US alliance, NATO, has become a two-tiered alliance, meaning the US does the heavy lifting, everyone else shows deep commitment by doing as little as possible, vowing with public resolve to fight to the last US soldier. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. It's always been like this. Katharine Hepburn once said of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, she gave him sex, he gave her class. And this is exactly the same for NATO and ANZUS. The Americans provide the clout, the Europeans give them political cover, and we give them a place for US Marines to train, which looks like a base to me, for the US Air Force to practice bombing, to anchor the southern end of whatever the US-China strategy is, and we front up to a fair number of wars. But now that we've deluded ourselves that we face a long period of peace, and we think that it's safe to question why we have alliances, we forget the famous words that echo across the great span of human endeavour. Peace is that brief, glorious moment in history when everybody stands around reloading. When things go bad, regardless of a US alliance, will the US want to assist us, or will they be able to assist us? As I've intimated, I'm a friend of the US, and I respect it, and I think that the US, sometimes imperfectly, tries to uphold values that I believe Australia should uphold if we actually gave ourselves the means. I often make the statement that the US military is without doubt the best in the world, and while acknowledging historically low levels of individual failures, the US wages war in a legal and ethical manner, so why not pile on board? The big clue lies in the work of a well-known Australian strategic analyst, Mark Thompson. Thompson recently just came out and said what for decades has been camouflaged by too clever by half strategic verbiage. He said the most logical strategic choice for Australia is to free ride on the US for our defence, but to his credit, he acknowledged its duplicity as a policy. Now, if you're going to free ride on any nation for your defence, then the US might be the best, until, of course, that free ride is tested. Free riding, ladies and gentlemen, is a strategy for war which undoubtedly works best in the absence of conflict. It's designed for extreme situations, but may not work in a serious war. Over time, we Australians have had various big and powerful friends that we've used as a strategic security blanket. At the end of our colonial period of dependency, Robert Menzies epitomised our reverent view of the mother country when he said of the Queen, "I did but see her passing by, and yet I loved her till I died."
Okay, that's the end of part one. Big ideas. Is the US alliance the best defence for Australia?